You're yellow, toothy, and get eaten alive right off the cob, like some medieval punishment. And that's not even the strangest part of your story. It gets weirder from here. Picture a valley somewhere in southern Mexico, 9,000 years ago. Hot, dry, and growing among the grasses is something so pathetic looking that no self-respecting god of agriculture would have bet a dime on it. A handful of kernels hard as rock, scattered along a seed head about the width of a pinky finger. No cob, no sweetness, just a loser of a grass called teosinte. But first, a hook worth holding on to. Botanists and geneticists argued for nearly 100 years trying to figure out how this scrap of grass ever turned into you. And honestly, they still haven't fully agreed. Here's one more little absurdity for the road. You have no wild ancestor that could survive in nature without humans. You literally cannot exist without babysitting. The cob doesn't even scatter its own seed. Your homeland is the Balsas River Valley in Mexico, and it was there, over dozens of generations, that local farmers did what nature couldn't manage in millions of years of evolution. They made a cob, a thicker stalk, softer kernels, more rows, and the stubborn habit of scattering seed the moment it ripened. Gone. Basically, you're the first great genetic engineering project in human history done without a single lab, using nothing but fingers and patience. And here's a pause for a little internal drama. Teosinte and you are so genetically and visually different that when botanists first compared you side by side, some flat out refused to believe you were related. Picture showing up to your high school reunion and nobody recognizes you because you got taller, bulkier, a completely different build. That's roughly how science felt about 100 years ago. For millennia, you were sacred. The Maya believed the gods molded human beings out of you, not clay, not wood, but corn dough. The Aztecs held rituals in your honor, where let's just say the stakes were considerably higher than crop yield. You weren't just food, you were the material humanity itself was supposedly made from, according to their mythology. Not bad for a grass that started out as a scrap. And while we're still deep in the past, it's worth mentioning another trick of yours that rarely gets taken seriously. Archaeologists have found charred kernels that popped from heat in caves in New Mexico, at least 5,000 years old. Yes, popcorn isn't a 20th century movie theater invention, and it's not some marketing gimmick from soda companies. It's one of the oldest ways of preparing you, something humanity has been doing for about as long as it's known how to build a fire next to a cob. Movie theaters just gave you a new setting. The trick itself is as old as the pyramids, just without the dramatic lighting. Time, meanwhile, was in no hurry to leave the Americas. While Europe was busy with crusades, spice trading, and cathedral building, you were growing peacefully across Mesoamerica, spreading from Mexico to Peru, from the plains to the Amazon jungle. The Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, they all grew you, all ate you, all worshipped you. The Inca, in particular, came up with a way to turn you into something considerably more fun than plain food. Chicha, a mildly alcoholic drink made by literally chewing your kernels and spitting them into a container, so the enzymes in saliva could kick off fermentation. Sounds unhygienic by modern standards, but it worked flawlessly, and chicha was served at state ceremonies and religious festivals across the empire, meaning you'd already been bred, a god, and the main party drink of an entire civilization, long before anyone in Europe had even figured out you could be turned into a beverage. And Europe had no idea you existed at all. Not a single Silk Road merchant could have brought you home even in theory, simply because an entire ocean lay between you and the rest of the world, one that mapmakers of the time had only the vaguest notion of. That changed abruptly, and without ceremony in 1492, when Columbus's ships landed on shores his passengers mistakenly called the Indies, along with gold, tobacco, and tall ales about strange natives. The sailors brought you home too. And here's rhetorical question number one. Did even a single Spanish sailor, stuffing cobs into the cargo hold between water barrels, have any idea he was holding a plant that 500 years later would feed more people on the planet than wheat and rice combined? Doubtful. Back then you were just a strange curiosity from the New World, right alongside the potato and the tomato, a trio that would go on to quietly upend the diets of intercontinents. Speaking of your name that deserves its own detour, because it comes with a mix-up worthy of a full-blown linguistic mystery. In Old English, the word corn meant simply grain in general. Any grain, wheat, oats, rye, whatever grew in a field and fed people. When English colonists arrived in America and saw you for the first time, they did what came naturally and called you Indian corn, meaning the local grain of the natives. Over time, the Indian qualifier dropped off on its own, and, in the New World, corn came to mean exclusively you, while in Britain, it still defaults to meaning wheat. So when a Brit and an American say corn, they're literally talking about two different plants, a mix-up that survived several centuries and has never once been fully sorted out by any dictionary. Europe adopted you far faster than, say, the potato, which was initially suspected of being poisonous and fed exclusively to pigs. You, on the other hand, caught on quickly. In Spain, Italy, the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire, the warm climate suited you just fine. The Italians turned you into polenta, the Romanians into mamalaga, and south of the Danube, you basically became the daily bread of the poor, flat out replacing wheat wherever it grew poorly. But Europe, in adopting you, forgot to pack one small yet critically important detail. In Mesoamerica, your kernels had been processed for millennia using a method called nixtamalization cobs, soaked and boiled in a lime or ash solution before grinding. This simple chemical process released niacin, a B vitamin that otherwise your body can't absorb at all. The Spanish and Italians, bringing you home, apparently decided the extra step with lime was some quirky habit of savages and started grinding the kernels raw. The result wasn't long in coming. In poor corn-dependent regions of Spain, Italy, and the Balkans, pellagra raged for centuries, a niacin deficiency disease that came with dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and quite often, death. Thousands of people died over the years, from a disease whose cause had nothing to do with you and everything to do with one skipped step in a recipe that Europeans were too proud to borrow from primitive peoples. And here's sarcastic comparison number one. You're like that immigrant who showed up with nothing, no papers, no reputation, and within a couple of generations became so thoroughly local that the locals are now arguing over whose national dish made with you is more authentic Italian polenta or Romanian mamaliga. But behind this quiet culinary success story lies a much darker chapter. You started being grown en masse in Africa. The Portuguese and other colonizers brought you there back in the 16th century, and you took hold so well that you reshaped entire food traditions on the continent. The problem is, you didn't arrive alone. You arrived in the holds of the very same ships, carrying people into slavery. Your cheapness and calorie density made you a convenient ration on slave ships, a grim detail rarely mentioned in the cheerful food history write-ups. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of Eurasia, you were building yourself a separate, far less bloody but no less remarkable career. You were most likely brought to China through Portugal and India sometime in the 16th century, and it turned out you grew beautifully on mountain and highland terrain, unsuited to traditional rice or wheat farming. The result was something demographers would later call one of the factors behind China's explosive population growth under the Qing dynasty. Previously empty hillsides in the provinces of Yunnan and Sichuan, the same provinces, incidentally, that were home to the subject of one of our earlier episodes, suddenly became capable of feeding people. The population of an empire, already considered the most populous on the planet, multiplied several times over within a couple of centuries, and you were one of the quiet, invisible causes of that growth, the kind that never makes it into history, textbooks alongside the names of emperors. Now let's take a detour to something entirely non-culinary. Indigenous peoples of the Americas had a whole philosophy built around you, the so-called Three Sisters. You, beans and squash, planted together in the same field. Your stalk served as a support pole for the bean vines. The beans enriched the soil with nitrogen, and the squash's sprawling leaves protected the ground from weeds and moisture loss. Three plants literally holding each other up. A farming system European agronomy wouldn't catch up to for several more centuries before slapping a trendy label on it: crop rotation, and acting like they'd invented it themselves. Rhetorical question number two. Isn't it a little ironic that an industry currently selling organic farming And permaculture, as some cutting-edge trend, is basically just rediscovering something indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica had been practicing for thousands of years without a marketing department in sight. And now, the most uncomfortable chapter of your biography, the one where your ancestral homeland loses to its own descendant, right on its own turf. At the end of the 20th century, Mexico signed a trade agreement with the US and Canada that opened its borders to cheap American grain, grown on the heavily subsidized fields of the Corn Belt. The problem is that small Mexican farmers who for centuries had grown dozens of local varieties of the so-called maíz criollo simply couldn't compete on price with their neighbors' industrial-scale production. The result turned out fairly bitter. The country that domesticated you, that prayed to you, that molded gods out of you, today imports a significant share of its own consumption of you from abroad. The father is now buying back from the son what he once gave him for free. Rhetorical question number 3. Doesn't it seem strange that a farmer in the Balsas Valley, just a few hours' drive from the exact spot where 9,000 years ago a handful of scraggly teosinte plants first turned into a cob, can today walk into a local store and buy grain grown in Iowa, nearly 1,900 miles away? History has a peculiar sense of humor. One more modern-day storyline worth mentioning without too much drama. Most of you growing today in the fields of the US, Argentina, or Brazil is genetically modified engineered to resist herbicides and pests. The debate around GMO has been running for decades now. Some say it saved global food production from famine. Others say it's made farmers dependent on a handful of agribusiness corporations that sell patented seed and forbid replanting it. You've ended up at the center of one of the fiercest agricultural debates of our time. Though you, obviously, have no opinion on any of it, you just grow wherever you're planted. The 20th century wasn't just another era for you, it was a full-blown status mutation. First came hybridization in the 1930s and 40s in the US. Agronomists learned to cross specific breeding lines in ways that sent yields exploding upward. Suddenly, one field was producing double, even triple, what it used to. They called it the Green Revolution, even though in reality it was just ordinary if brilliant selective breeding. You'd finally gotten the upgrade you'd been waiting millennia for. And then something far bigger and far less romantic happened. You stopped being just food on a plate. You became raw material. Cornstarch, corn oil, and above all high-fructose corn syrup, which starting in the 1970s quietly began replacing sugar in almost everything. Soft drinks, ketchup, bread, sauces, baby food. American farm policy and government subsidies made you so cheap that it became more profitable for manufacturers to sweeten food with you than with old-fashioned cane or beet sugar. And here's sarcastic comparison number 2. Picture some unassuming accountant quietly working out of a basement office, who suddenly turns out to hold a controlling stake in half the companies in town, simply because everyone forgot to check the fine print in the contracts. That's you, except instead of stock shares, it's an ingredient in tens of thousands of products on supermarket shelves that almost nobody notices while skimming the label. They didn't stop at pouring you into food. They make ethanol out of biofuel that US law requires be blended into regular gasoline. They make biodegradable plastic out of you, paper cups, glue, even certain textiles. You stopped being a plant in any conventional sense. You became an entire industry with roots in the ground. Rhetorical question number 4. How many agricultural crops can claim they simultaneously feed livestock, sweeten soda, fuel cars, and get printed on labels as an organic product? Not many, practically none. Today, you're grown on an area of land larger than the combined territory of many countries. And the lion's share of that harvest isn't the sweet cob you picture at a summer cookout. It's so-called feed corn or field corn. Hard, unsweet, meant not for human mouths but for animal feed mills, starch plants, and ethanol tanks. That sweet yellow cob sold at the farmer's market in summer is just a small, fairly privileged minority of your species. The US remains the world's largest producer of you. And the crop is so deeply woven into the country's economy and politics that Iowa, the heart of the Corn Belt, effectively determines the early frontrunners in presidential primaries. No candidate skips the chance to publicly eat a cob on camera and praise the local farmers. You stopped being just a food product a long time ago. You became a political ritual. But it's not just the US that lives off you. Ukraine is one of the world's leading exporters of you, and your fields stretch from Poltava to Odessa, feeding not just the domestic market, but half the ports of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. In years when Black Sea shipping lanes came under threat, your price on world markets jumped more noticeably than the price of oil. Not many grain crops can say. Their fate makes the same news broadcast as geopolitics and missile strikes. You stopped being just an agricultural product a long time ago. You became a line item in stock market analysts' reports. There's also a completely unserious side to your modern life, worth mentioning if only for contrast. In the US and Canada, every fall, entire fields of you get turned into giant mazes for tourists. The corn maze, where families wander between the stalks for photo ops and a day out. A plant that was once, according to Maya mythology, the sacred material humans were made from, now serves as a backdrop for selfies behind a $10 ticket. The evolution of your status is, let's say, complicated. And here's rhetorical question number 5, the last one. Did those farmers in the Balsas Valley, 9,000 years ago, slowly and patiently selecting the softest kernels of teosinte, have any idea that one day their humble grass would help decide who becomes President of the United States, while simultaneously washing dishes in the form of a biodegradable bag? Doubtful. They just wanted something more filling than grass to eat. And here's your final scene, your climax. You went from a pathetic scrap of teosinte that nature itself wouldn't have kept alive without a human hand, to the sacred material the Maya believed humans themselves were molded from. You were carried to Europe as an exotic curiosity alongside gold and tobacco, and quietly pushed wheat out of entire stretches of the Balkans, while incidentally killing thousands of people with a disease whose real cause wasn't you at all, but one forgotten step in a recipe. You were hauled in the holds of slave ships as a cheap ration, and later became the backbone of biofuel that powers cars in the world's wealthiest countries. You were hybridized, subsidized, genetically modified, dissolved into every sugary drink on the supermarket shelf, and all the while, people still grill you over charcoal and sprinkle you with salt at street stalls, just like they did thousands of years ago. Your ancestral homeland now buys you back from its own descendant, while your Ukrainian fields feed half the Mediterranean, and stock analysts track your price more closely than oil. You're a plant with no wild ancestor, one that can't even reproduce without human help. And yet somehow, you manage to become so indispensable that you shape the economy, the politics, and the diet of half the planet. Teosinte, that pathetic scrap of grass from a Mexican valley, had absolutely no idea what it was about to become, and will keep tracing these unexpected paths from forgotten field grasses to global empires. If you're curious where the next story takes us, stick around. Subscribing helps make sure you don't miss it.